November 12th, 1942. Richmond, California. The morning began gray and cold, the kind of dawn that smelled of salt and steel. Across the edge of San Francisco Bay, cranes moved like prehistoric birds, their steel necks groaning as they lifted beams into place. The air trembled with the hiss of welding torches, sparks cascading down like brief showers of orange rain. The bay itself was quiet, blanketed in fog thick enough to swallow the sound of waves. And yet, behind that veil of mist, something extraordinary was happening, something the world would call impossible. Inside the Permanente Metals Corporation's Yard Number 2, a ship stood ready. Not a small one, not a barge or tugboat, but a full-grown cargo vessel, 441 feet long, weighing nearly 14,000 tons. Its name was painted across the bow in fresh white letters, SS Robert E. Peary. She was a Liberty ship, one of the mass-produced lifelines that carried war to every corner of the globe. But this one wasn't ordinary. She was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. No one believed it could be done. Not the naval engineers who'd spent their lives measuring hulls by months, not weeks. Not the old shipwrights who still traced patterns in chalk across oak planks. Not even the newspaper men who had come that morning, their hats pulled low against the wind, expecting to write an obituary for an experiment gone wrong. The scene felt more like a miracle than a launch. The dry dock was alive with movement, women in heavy gloves wiping soot from their cheeks, men in denim overalls shouting above the din, the rhythmic pounding of hammers echoing across the yard. They were welders, not shipwrights. Housewives, clerks, farmhands, school teachers, ordinary Americans who had traded typewriters and plows for torches and steel masks. Many had never seen the ocean before this war. Now, they were building the vessels that would cross it. A young woman in a red kerchief tightened her gloves, sparks flashing in the dark circle of her welding mask. She had started 3 weeks earlier, barely learning to fuse steel without burning through it. Today, she was sealing the seams of the hull that would soon cut across the Pacific. Beside her, a man who once repaired tractors in Iowa guided a crane hook down onto a massive steel plate, the cable trembling under its own weight. The yard pulsed like a living organism, shift whistles blowing, the clang of dropped hammers echoing through the morning, steam hissing from pressure valves, cranes moving in perfect mechanical rhythm. Beyond the workers, on a raised platform, stood the dignitaries, officials in long coats, clipboards in hand, eyes skeptical. They'd seen records broken before, but this was absurd. A Liberty ship in less than 5 days? Impossible. One naval architect muttered, "You can't compress 6 months into a work week." But as he spoke, the fog began to lift, revealing the ship's steel flanks, the weld seams glistening like veins of light. Reporters crowded together, the smell of ink and camera flash powder mingling with the metallic tang of the air. One of them, a correspondent from the Chronicle, whispered to another, "Even if she floats, she won't hold. Welds like that will tear apart in a storm." The other nodded, scribbling notes, both men unaware they were watching the dawn of a revolution. At 3:30 p.m., the whistle blew. The last scaffolds were pulled away. Workers climbed down from the hull, their faces streaked with soot, their hands trembling with exhaustion and disbelief. The launch crew moved into position, hammering away the wooden chocks that held the ship upright. The tide was perfect. The crowd grew silent. A single voice echoed through the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, Liberty ship number 2510, the SS Robert E. Peary." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the great hull shuddered, groaned, and began to move. Slowly at first, an inch, then 2, until gravity claimed her. The chains rattled loose. The ship began to slide down the greased slipway, cutting through the fog like a blade. Sparks flared as steel kissed steel, water roaring against the bow. The workers screamed, hats thrown into the air, the sound rising like a wave that crashed across the yard. For many watching, it wasn't just a launch. It was a revelation. Henry Kaiser himself stood at the edge of the dock, his coat collar turned up against the wind. His eyes reflected the glow of the ship sliding into the bay. For 2 years, he'd fought to prove that mass production could apply to ships just as it did to cars. For 2 years, experts laughed at him, said welding was too brittle, said prefabrication would never work. But now, as the Peary hit the water and rolled gently upright, Kaiser simply smiled. The bay erupted with horns and sirens. Tugboats bellowed. The workers cheered until their throats ached. Journalists scrambled for quotes. A Navy officer wiped his glasses and whispered, "Good Lord, they actually did it." The ship floated, perfectly balanced, perfectly stable. The impossible had just happened. In that moment, no one cared about the clock, or the record, or even the war beyond the horizon. What mattered was the proof. Proof that human will, multiplied by organization and belief, could rewrite the laws of industry itself. A photographer climbed onto a crate and captured the image that would appear in newspapers the next morning. Sparks still raining from cranes, smoke curling around the bow, the reflection of the Peary shimmering in the gray water. Beneath it, the caption would read, "4 days to freedom." As evening settled, the yard quieted. Floodlights flickered on, bathing the ship in a soft white glow. The workers lingered, reluctant to leave. Some held hands, others leaned against warm steel plates, listening to the echo of their own heartbeat inside the hull. One man whispered, "I welded that seam." Another replied, "And I fit that bulkhead." They spoke not with pride, but with awe, as if they'd built something far larger than a ship, something that would outlive them. Farther down the bay, a seagull perched on a piling, the last rays of daylight glinting off the water. The fog began to roll back in, wrapping the ship in a ghostly shroud once more. For a fleeting moment, it looked less like a vessel and more like a monument, an altar to what ordinary hands could achieve when the nation decided to move as one. And somewhere in the distance, across the Pacific, in the burning shadows of war, men in uniform waited for ships like this. They didn't know her name, didn't know the faces that built her. But they would load her with cargo, sleep in her bunks, curse her slow speed, and bless her reliability. The SS Robert E. Peary would join a fleet that kept democracy alive through sheer momentum. Later that night, as the last workers filed out, a single welder turned back. He lifted his mask, squinting up at the ship one last time. The wind off the bay carried the faint smell of ozone and steel. He whispered something no one heard. Maybe a prayer, maybe a promise. The floodlights dimmed. The ship rocked gently against her moorings. Somewhere inside the yard, a clock stopped ticking. History had been rewritten, not in speeches or battles, but in the brief, blinding flare of 1,000 torches, wielded by hands that refused to believe in impossible. 2 years earlier, December 1940, the Pacific wind carried the smell of diesel and uncertainty as Henry J. Kaiser stood outside his new shipyard, staring at a flat expanse of mud. The tide crawled in sluggishly, leaving behind puddles that mirrored a gray California sky. He wore a dark fedora, a heavy wool coat, and an expression that mixed determination with disbelief. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't a shipbuilder, not by any stretch of the imagination. He was a dam builder, an industrial outsider who had carved mountains and tamed rivers. He had poured concrete where no one believed a wall could stand. The Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee, Bonneville. Those feats had earned him respect in Washington, but not in the shipyards. Among the old maritime elite, men with sea salt in their veins and ship models in glass cases, Henry Kaiser was a construction cowboy. And yet, in the winter of 1940, he'd signed a contract to build 30 ships for Britain, vessels desperately needed to fight Hitler's U-boats strangling the Atlantic. The British government had approached him out of desperation, hoping his reputation for speed could translate into survival. Kaiser said yes before he even knew where to begin. The shipbuilding establishment laughed. In the smoky back rooms of the Maritime Commission in Washington, officers and executives shook their heads. A dam builder? One muttered. He's going to build ships like he pours concrete? Another added, You can't pour concrete into an ocean. They chuckled, certain the experiment would collapse under its own arrogance. But Kaiser wasn't listening to the laughter. He was listening to the rhythm of progress. He began visiting automobile factories, Ford's Rouge plant in Michigan, where chassis slid down assembly lines in perfect synchronization. He watched engines lowered into frames, bodies welded, paint sprayed, glass fitted, all while the workers never stopped moving. A car could be born every minute. And in that thunderous motion, Kaiser saw a revelation. If cars could be built like that, why not ships? Why should a ship take months, even a year, when it was just another machine? Larger, yes, but still bolts, plates, engines, and welds? He began sketching ideas on yellow paper, modular sections, prefabricated hull panels, electric welding replacing slow hand riveting. In his vision, ships would no longer crawl out of slipways like handcrafted relics. They would roll off assembly lines like automobiles, like liberty itself, mass-produced. Back in Washington, Vice Admiral Emory Land, head of the U.S. Maritime Commission, received Kaiser's proposal with weary patience. The admiral had built ships his whole life. He respected the traditions of the craft, the pride of shipwrights tracing curves on drafting boards, the sound of hammers over rivets echoing across the yards. Welding, to him, was an untested novelty, a risky shortcut. In early 1941, Land sent Kaiser a polite but cutting letter. Welding has never been proven for hulls at this scale. Kaiser pinned the letter to his office wall, not out of defiance, but as a reminder of the line he intended to cross. Tradition on one side, revolution on the other. He hired engineers who didn't belong, airplane welders, dam mechanics, auto plant supervisors. He built classrooms inside the yard where women and men learned how to weld in weeks. He banned the word can't. When one foreman told him the yard didn't have enough trained shipwrights, Kaiser famously said, "Then we'll train them ourselves." And he did. Soon, trains began arriving from every direction. Boxcars filled with machinery, cranes, cables, and workers who had never seen anything like this. Teenagers from Oklahoma, housewives from Portland, a black mechanic from Louisiana who'd been turned away from a Navy shipyard for the color of his skin. Kaiser hired him without a second thought. "If you can weld," he said, "you can work." The old guard scoffed at this patchwork army. "They're amateurs," one shipyard executive told the San Francisco Examiner. "They'll never hold schedule." But by spring, the mudflats had transformed into a skeleton of steel and concrete, rails crisscrossing like veins, cranes rising against the gray skyline like cathedral spires. Kaiser didn't build a shipyard. He built a city designed for motion. Each section of a Liberty ship was assigned a number, just like parts in a factory. Hull segments were fabricated in one zone, decks in another. Engines and boilers came pre-assembled from inland plants. Everything was timed to arrive at the slipway like organs ready for transplant. Still, the ridicule continued. Rival shipbuilders called him Hollywood Henry. Newspapers joked that he should stick to pouring concrete. Even his allies in Washington advised caution. But Kaiser thrived on doubt. He would often walk the yard at night, long after the workday ended, the floodlights painting the mud silver. He'd stop by a group of welders cleaning their torches, kneel beside them, and ask how to make the process faster, safer, better. He never asked questions to test them. He asked because he genuinely didn't know, and that humility became his greatest strength. Curiosity turned into confidence. Confidence became a movement. By summer, Kaiser's first shipyard in Richmond was ready. Not a ship had yet touched water, but the system was alive. Assembly lines moved. Welding arcs lit up the dusk. The sound of progress rolled like thunder down the bay. Henry Kaiser watched from a small office overlooking the slipways. His secretary brought him coffee as he studied blueprints pinned to the wall. Each line represented a gamble: prefabrication, modular design, standardized parts, electric welding, mass training of unskilled labor. Any one of them could fail and sink his reputation forever. He remembered the words of his critics, the laughter, the sneers. "You can't pour concrete into an ocean." He smiled at that line. He had no intention of pouring concrete. He was about to pour faith. When the first Liberty ship began taking shape, welded, not riveted, the old shipwrights came to see it for themselves. They stood with arms crossed, watching sparks fly from seams that glowed white-hot. One of them muttered, "That'll crack like glass once it hits cold water." Kaiser said nothing. He simply nodded to his welders and kept them working. As the hull grew, piece by piece, his vision grew with it. This was no longer about ships. It was about proving that industry could evolve faster than war itself. One day, while walking through the yard, Kaiser stopped at a station where women were welding bulkhead plates. They were sweating under their masks, hands steady, arcs bright as lightning. He asked one, "How long have you been welding?" She lifted her mask, eyes squinting from the light. "3 weeks," she said. He nodded, smiled, and whispered, "Then you're already a veteran." Word spread through the yard that the boss treated everyone like family. He built childcare centers for working mothers, medical clinics for injured laborers, cafeterias that stayed open past midnight. The men and women who worked there began to call themselves Kaiser's Army. And like any army, they were preparing for war, against inefficiency, against tradition, against impossibility. Still, Washington doubted. Vice Admiral Land sent inspectors to the yard, convinced he'd find chaos. Instead, he found rhythm. He watched as cranes swung pre-assembled sections into place with mathematical precision, as welders sealed seams in minutes that once took hours. He returned to his hotel in silence. That night, in his diary, he wrote, "Perhaps he's onto something. God help us if he is." By the fall of 1941, the first Liberty ships began rolling off Kaiser's ways faster than any in the country. They weren't perfect, crude in form, boxy and slow, but they floated. And more importantly, they delivered. For every ship sunk in the Atlantic, another rose from the mud of Richmond. The laughter stopped. The old guard fell silent. The skeptics in Washington began sending telegrams that started with the same word: more. Kaiser didn't celebrate. He simply built faster. He expanded his yards, trained more workers, simplified the process until even the impossible seemed like a rounding error. The man who had once been told he didn't belong was now the architect of America's industrial miracle. One night, months before Pearl Harbor, Kaiser stood again at the edge of his yard. The cranes loomed above him, silhouetted against the full moon. He could hear the clang of distant hammers, the low hum of the power station, the faint whistle of a night train bringing more steel. He took off his hat, held it against his chest, and whispered to himself, "We're not building ships. We're building belief." When war finally came to America, Henry Kaiser and his shipyards were already ahead of it. He was no longer the outsider. He was the man who had dared to try, and proved that daring was the engine of victory. By the summer of 1941, the mudflats along Richmond's shoreline no longer looked like coastline. They looked like the future. Where gulls once nested, now stood an industrial cathedral, its walls made of scaffolding, its hymn the clang of hammers and the roar of diesel cranes. Henry Kaiser's vision had materialized not as a single shipyard, but as a living city devoted entirely to speed. Morning began before dawn. Steam hissed from the pipes, fog swirled around floodlights, and train whistles screamed through the dark as boxcars arrived loaded with steel plates from Pittsburgh and turbines from Chicago. A foreman's whistle pierced the cold, and suddenly thousands of men and women moved like clockwork, each with a role, each a gear in something vast and unstoppable. They came from everywhere. A farm girl from Kansas who'd never seen a factory before, a barber from Arkansas whose hands still shook from cutting hair, a nurse from Oregon who became a welding inspector. They arrived carrying suitcases, lunch pails, and hope, stepping off buses that smelled of diesel and dreams. Many had never been given a chance before. Some couldn't read blueprints, Others couldn't read at all, but Kaiser didn't care. He taught them anyway. The Richmond shipyards were more than an experiment. They were an experiment in democracy itself. People of every color, background, and language worked side by side. They wore the same gloves, the same helmets, their faces marked by the same soot. No one cared who you were before, only that you showed up, learned fast, and gave everything you had. Inside the fabrication shops, the air shimmered with heat. Sparks cascaded down from welding rigs like showers of gold. Overhead, cranes creaked as they swung pre-assembled sections, each one the size of a small house, into position. It looked chaotic from above, but down on the floor, it was perfectly choreographed. Every worker moved with purpose. Every tool had its place. Kaiser's genius wasn't just speed, it was structure. He divided the shipbuilding process into 1,000 repeatable tasks. No more artisans shaping curves by hand. No more waiting for rivet lines to cool. Every component of a Liberty ship was standardized, labeled, and scheduled to arrive at the exact moment it was needed. In one bay, men welded together the keel plates. In another, women bolted bulkheads. A third group installed pre-assembled deckhouses, complete with wiring and plumbing, as if snapping together a giant metallic puzzle. Out on the docks, the scene looked like something out of science fiction. Cranes moving in harmony, trains unloading steel sections that fit perfectly into the ship's growing skeleton, electric welders sparking under the drizzle. Above the roar, a loudspeaker crackled with instructions. Section 12 to slipway 3. Engine assembly to bay 4. Keep the lines clear. The workers moved without hesitation. The transformation was staggering. What had once taken 197 days to build now took less than half that time. Then less again. 169, 128, 97. The numbers fell like dominoes, each ship faster than the last. The calendar pages seemed to rip themselves away. Journalists began calling the phenomenon Kaiser time. To his workers, it was simply the race. Every week brought new arrivals, new workers, new cranes, new records. The shipyard stretched farther along the bay until it seemed to merge with the horizon. The noise never stopped. Day and night, torches hissed, engines growled, floodlights burned through fog thick as milk. It was a world of perpetual motion. Kaiser himself was rarely seen standing still. He strode through the yards with a clipboard and a smile that could disarm a skeptic. He shook hands with welders, asked about their kids, praised their speed, and then reminded them that the next ship had to be faster. He believed in competition, not between men, but between days. Yesterday's record, he told them, is tomorrow's baseline. Reporters followed him like shadows, their notebooks filling with phrases that sounded like prophecy. Factories that float, the assembly line navy, democracy's dockyard. And yet, beneath the noise and pride, there was exhaustion too. The work was brutal. Heat, smoke, noise, it wore people down. Many workers lived in hastily built housing near the yard, tiny wooden shacks crowded with families. They rose before sunrise, stood in welding boots for 12 hours, then returned to homes that rattled with the distant pounding of ship riveters. But they didn't complain. They knew what they were building. For every Liberty ship that slipped into the bay, dozens of American soldiers somewhere in the world gained a lifeline. Crates of food, tanks, fuel, medicine, everything needed to fight the war flowed through those steel hulls. The workers called them Kaiser's babies. On one particular morning in early 1942, the fog was so thick you could barely see 10 feet ahead. The night shift had just finished. As the morning shift filed in, the silhouettes of two ships emerged side by side on neighboring slipways. They looked like mountains rising from mist. A photographer climbed a crane to capture the view. The resulting image, two Liberty ships under construction, bow to bow, with welding arcs flashing like lightning, would appear in Life magazine under the caption, "Factories that Float." Inside the yard's cafeteria, a small radio broadcasted updates from overseas. German U-boats sinking Allied ships faster than Britain could replace them. The workers listened in silence as the announcer described convoys burning in the Atlantic. Then the foreman clapped his hands and said, "That's why we work." No one needed to say more. They filed back out into the smoke. The numbers continued to climb. By the end of 1942, Kaiser's Richmond yards had produced more than 140 Liberty ships, each one built faster than the last. It wasn't just Richmond anymore. His system spread like wildfire. Portland, Vancouver, and other coastal cities adopted his methods. America had turned its coastlines into an unbroken chain of ship factories. But the most astonishing part wasn't the machinery. It was the people. Kaiser's yards were among the first in the nation to hire women in large numbers. Rosie the Riveter may have become a symbol, but long before she appeared on posters, women in Richmond were already living that story. They were mothers, widows, teachers, students, women who had never been allowed near heavy industry. Now they welded steel plates that would sail into war zones. One of them, a 23-year-old named Edna, later told a reporter, "Every time I strike an arc, I think of my brother in uniform. Every spark feels like a bullet we're sending back at the enemy." Black Americans, too, found opportunity in Kaiser's yards unlike anywhere else. While other industries closed doors, Kaiser opened them. He didn't do it for charity. He did it because he couldn't afford prejudice to slow him down. A skilled worker was a skilled worker, period. By mid-1943, the Richmond yard looked like an industrial battlefield, steam rolling through the avenues, locomotives rattling along tracks that led directly into construction bays, forklifts weaving through crowds of workers. The yard employed over 90,000 people, making it the largest industrial complex on the West Coast. From aerial photographs, it resembled a circuit board. Energy, light, and coordination flowing through every inch. To the untrained eye, it looked chaotic. But to Henry Kaiser, it was music. He often climbed to the roof of his headquarters at dusk, watching cranes swing like metronomes, sparks drifting through the air like fireflies. He'd light a cigar, lean on the railing, and whisper to his engineers, "Look at that. That's America working in rhythm." Every ship that launched carried more than cargo. It carried proof that when ordinary people were organized and trusted, they could do the impossible again and again, and the world began to notice. Reporters from The Times, Newsweek, and Life crowded the docks, sending stories back east describing a miracle on the bay. A British correspondent wrote, "The Kaiser yards build ships the way Britain bakes bread, by the dozen, every day." One visiting admiral stood in stunned silence as he watched two hull sections being joined in less than an hour. "Gentlemen," he said quietly to his staff, "this is not industry. This is invention, but not everyone celebrated." In older shipyards back east, resentment brewed. Generations of craftsmen who'd built ships by hand felt overshadowed by this mechanical revolution. They whispered that Kaiser's ships were weak, that welded hulls would crack in the open sea. Some even called them Kaiser coffins. But when those ships began surviving Atlantic storms and enemy attacks, the nickname faded into silence. Meanwhile, the speed continued. Every improvement led to another. Every challenge became a new efficiency. When a bottleneck appeared, Kaiser's engineers redesigned the process overnight. A new welding method cut joint times in half. Pre-painted steel reduced rust delays. Even lunch breaks were staggered to keep the lines moving continuously. And the people, those ordinary men and women, began to realize they were part of something unprecedented. A worker could start on Monday with a bare keel, and by the next weekend, see that same ship slide into the bay. Each launch was like a festival. Families gathered along the water, children waving flags, brass bands playing. When the massive hulls hit the water, the crowd erupted with cheers that shook the cranes. By late 1943, the question was no longer whether America could win the war, it was how fast it could do it. That autumn, a reporter standing on a Richmond rooftop watched 5 Liberty ships under construction side by side. Sparks flew, cranes moved, floodlights burned through fog. He turned to his photographer and said, If they can build ships this fast, what can't they build? It was not a boast. It was an awakening. Henry Kaiser's dream had come true. The factory floor had reached the ocean. America had built not just ships, but a machine that could outproduce tyranny. And from that moment on, time itself would become a weapon. It began as a challenge. Not from Washington, not from the Navy, but from Henry Kaiser himself. By late 1942, his Richmond yards had become the beating heart of American industry. Ships were rolling into the water every few days. Schedules that once stretched across seasons now collapsed into weeks. But Kaiser wasn't satisfied. He wanted proof that there was no limit, not even time itself. He called a meeting in the glass-walled office that overlooked the slipways. Outside, the fog drifted through floodlights, turning the cranes into silhouettes of metal giants. Inside, his engineers gathered around a long oak table cluttered with blueprints and coffee mugs. Kaiser leaned forward, his fedora resting beside his notes. "We've built them in weeks," he said quietly. "Now let's see if we can build one in days." There was silence. Then nervous laughter. One foreman cleared his throat. "Days, sir? You mean less than 10? Less than 5? Kaiser said. The room froze. Someone's pencil snapped in half. The ship he proposed would be a Liberty-class cargo vessel, the same 441-foot steel workhorse that had become the backbone of Allied logistics. But this one would be different. Every weld, every component, every motion would be timed like a symphony. 3 shifts, working around the clock. No pauses, no weekends. At first, even his own engineers thought he'd gone mad. The fastest record so far was 7.5 days, and that had nearly broken the yard. But Kaiser didn't back down. He believed limits only existed until someone ignored them. He pointed out the window toward the dark bay. "Gentlemen, one day history will say we built ships faster than anyone believed possible. Let's make that day this week." The experiment began under code name Operation Instant Ship. November 8, 1942, midnight. Searchlights carved beams through the fog as sirens wailed across yard number 2. Workers poured in by the thousands, lunch pails swinging, faces grim with determination. The floodlights flicked on, bathing the site in white brilliance. The ship's keel had already been laid earlier that evening. Above it, scaffolding rose like a forest of steel. The clock started. Shift 1 moved in. Engine crews, welders, fitters, crane operators. They weren't veterans. Most had joined the yard within the past year. But they knew what was at stake. The whistle blew, and the noise began. A sound that would not stop for 5 days and nights. Sparks filled the air. Cranes swung hull sections into place, each one prefabricated and waiting like puzzle pieces. Welders sealed seams with arcs of blue flame, the smell of ozone and molten metal thick in the cold air. Every movement was recorded, every hour tracked. Foremen with stopwatches timed each crew, shaving seconds where they could. Kaiser's command center looked like an air traffic tower, engineers watching progress on charts, radios crackling with updates from every section. Section 6 complete. Deckhouse ready. Engine unit en route. The pace was furious but organized. By dawn, the yard looked like a battlefield. Smoke rising, men shouting orders, steel clanging against steel. In the cafeteria, coffee flowed like fuel. No one talked about the war overseas. Their war was right here, against the clock. Day 1 ended with the keel complete, the sides of the hull already rising above the scaffolds. Newspapers got wind of the attempt. Headlines began to appear. Kaiser aims for 5-day ship. Skeptics predicted disaster. "It'll fall apart before it hits the water," one columnist wrote. Another mocked, "You can't build a battleship the way you build a biscuit." Kaiser clipped those headlines and pinned them next to Admiral Land's old letter. Day 2. Rain hammered the bay. Floodlights glowed through the downpour like halos. Crews worked knee-deep in mud, sparks sizzling as they hit puddles. The rain mixed with sweat and soot, running down faces streaked with grime. Inside the hull, The engine crew lowered the massive 140-ton power plant into position, an operation that normally took 2 days, done now in 12 hours. One reporter who sneaked into the yard described it later as the closest thing to industrial war I've ever seen. Thousands of people fighting time itself. Day 3. The yard smelled of oil, metal, and exhaustion. Welders' hands trembled from fatigue. Women in the electrical bays wrapped wiring harnesses while humming to stay awake. Mechanics tuned valves under floodlights that cast their faces in ghostly glow. A whistle shrieked every 12 hours to signal shift changes. Nobody stopped. One welder named Joe Harper later recalled, "We forgot what day it was. All we knew was the ship had to float. You'd close your eyes, see sparks. Open them, see steel." By now, journalists lined the fence outside, flashes popping as they captured the glowing hull rising out of the mist. A local radio announcer broadcast updates hourly. "Day 3, he said into the microphone, his voice trembling with excitement. "And the Peary is already halfway complete. If you can hear me across the bay, you're listening to History in Motion Day 4. The sun rose pale and tired. Crews moved like ghosts, black silhouettes against orange sparks. Cafeterias handed out sandwiches and coffee non-stop. Doctors treated burns, cuts, exhaustion, but no one went home. The welders joked that if you stopped to rest, someone would weld you into the hull." In the command room, Kaiser stood over a map of the yard covered in red pins. Each pin represented a finished section. He moved the last one into place and exhaled slowly. "We're ahead of schedule," he said. That night, the tide charts confirmed the launch could happen the next afternoon. Word spread instantly. The workers didn't cheer, they didn't have the energy, but their faces lit up with a pride deeper than sleep. Day 5. November 12th, 1942. The fog returned, heavy and motionless over the bay. By mid-morning, the hull gleamed under the floodlights, painted and sealed. The ship's name, SS Robert E. Peary, shone in white letters across her bow. The decks were manned, engines tested, compartments inspected. She was ready. At 3:30 p.m., the siren sounded one final time. The floodlights dimmed and silence fell across the yard. Thousands of workers, men, women, children of workers, reporters, admirals, stood shoulder to shoulder, breath visible in the cold air. Vice Admiral Emery Land was there too, the same man who once wrote that welding was unproven. He stared at the ship through the fog, his gloved hands clasped tightly. A loudspeaker crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to witness the launch of the SS Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. There was a pause, a heartbeat of disbelief. Then, the sound, the wooden chocks cracked, chains clattered loose, and the ship began to move. Slowly at first, sliding down the greased slipway, then faster, until she hit the water with a thunderous roar. The waves surged back across the dock, soaking the boots of the front row workers. Cheers erupted, raw, primal, unstoppable. Hats flew into the air, arms lifted high, men and women screaming through tears. The Peary floated perfectly upright. No cracks, no buckling, no leaks. She was alive. Vice Admiral Land removed his cap, eyes glistening. 6 months ago, he said softly to a reporter beside him, I'd have called this impossible. Henry Kaiser has made wisdom obsolete cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled to wire their stories. A photographer captured Kaiser standing at the water's edge, his hat in hand, the reflection of the Peary shimmering beside him. That photograph would appear in papers across the country under the headline, The 5-Day Miracle. But inside the yard, the moment was quieter. The workers didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as proof. One woman, her welding gloves still black with soot, whispered to the man beside her, "We did that." He nodded, too tired to speak. Around them, floodlights hummed back to life, cranes groaned, and the next keel plate was already being rolled into place. The war wasn't over. The work wasn't either. That night, as the crowd dispersed, Kaiser stayed behind. The bay was calm, the ship's lights reflected in the water like stars. He walked alone along the pier, coat flapping in the wind, boots echoing on the planks. He paused beside the bow, placed a hand against the cold steel, and smiled. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The ship said it for him. Across the country, Americans woke the next morning to headlines that felt almost unreal. Cargo ship built in 4 days. Industrial miracle on the Pacific. Kaiser's speed becomes America's secret weapon. Factories from Detroit to Dallas posted those clippings on bulletin boards. In classrooms, teachers read them aloud to students. In army barracks, soldiers passed newspapers from bunk to bunk, marveling at the idea that home could move faster than war. Henry Kaiser's gamble had become gospel. For every enemy bomb that fell, America would answer with production. For every ship lost, 2 more would rise. The war had entered a new phase, one fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with time itself as the weapon. As night settled over Richmond, the fog returned, rolling in thick and silver. The Peary rocked gently against her lines, her hull steaming from the sudden chill. The cranes fell silent, the floodlights dimmed, and somewhere in that quiet, amid the smell of steel and salt, one could almost hear the echo of a heartbeat, the pulse of 1,000 ordinary Americans who had refused to believe in impossible. They had not merely built a ship, they had built faith made of iron. When the war finally ended, the sound that had once filled the Richmond shipyards, the hammers, the cranes, the whistles, faded into silence. The great forest of masts that had crowded the bay was gone, scattered across every ocean on Earth. The floodlights went dark, the trains stopped bringing steel, and for the first time in years, the night was quiet enough to hear the tide. The workers, those men and women who had built the impossible, stood at the edge of the empty docks, not quite knowing what to do with their hands. Some still wore their helmets, though the sparks had stopped flying weeks ago. Others clutched the time cards they'd kept as mementos, creased and oil-stained. The war that had given their lives meaning was over, and with its end came a strange, echoing stillness. Henry Kaiser walked through the empty yard one last time. The fog was the same as always, but the world had changed. He could still smell the metal and diesel, still hear the faint memory of cranes groaning in the wind. The concrete slabs where the SS Robert E. Peary had once stood were cracked with weeds now. But in the silence, he could feel the weight of what had been done here. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes, and an idea that would ripple through history. The newspapers called him the man who built victory. But Kaiser never believed he'd built ships. He believed he'd built people. Many of those welders and fitters, women who had never held a torch before, men who had never read a blueprint, went on to rebuild America itself. They carried their discipline, their speed, their belief into everything they touched. Some became engineers, teachers, factory foremen. Others returned to farms and small towns, bringing with them a quiet certainty that ordinary hands could shape extraordinary futures. One of the welders, a woman named Mabel from Modesto, once said to a reporter years later, "I didn't just learn to weld steel. I learned to weld faith, to take something broken and make it whole again." Her words outlived her. Kaiser didn't fade away either. His restlessness wouldn't let him. The lessons of the shipyards turned into something far larger than he'd ever imagined. The idea that had begun with Liberty ships, modular design, teamwork, speed through organization, became the blueprint for modern industry itself. In the years that followed, he founded Kaiser Aluminum, Kaiser Steel, and Kaiser Motors. He built houses the same way he had built ships, prefabricated, standardized, affordable. Whole neighborhoods sprang up like Liberty ships on land. Families who had once lived in poverty found themselves owning homes built with the same efficiency that had built victory. And then came the idea that changed lives far beyond the factory floor: Kaiser Permanente. It began as a health plan for shipyard workers, men and women who had no safety net. But the system worked so well that it became a model for modern healthcare. Organized, preventive, humane. What had started in a muddy shipyard became a symbol of care that still carries his name today. Yet even as his empire expanded, Kaiser never forgot the yard. He returned often, walking among the rusted cranes and silent slipways, tracing his hand along the railings where sparks once flew. Sometimes he'd stand at the water's edge at sunset, staring at the horizon, remembering the day the Peary touched the bay. To the workers who remained, he wasn't a tycoon. He was simply Henry, the man who once told them that time could be bent if belief was strong enough. The Liberty ships themselves scattered across the globe. Some carried food to starving nations, some transported refugees home. Many never returned, torpedoed, bombed, broken by storms. But even those that sank left behind something indestructible: proof. The SS John W. Brown survived. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, welded in the same fevered months as the Peary, crossed the Atlantic again 50 years later, steaming proudly into Normandy Harbor during the 50th anniversary of D-Day. Veterans wept on her decks, touching the steel seams with trembling hands, whispering to ghosts. "She's still here," one of them said, voice cracking. They said she wouldn't last a year. She's outlived us all. The world that followed that war inherited more than victory. It inherited a way of thinking. Japan and Korea would later study Kaiser's methods, building their shipyards on the same principles: modular construction, continuous flow, teamwork over hierarchy. The very rhythm that built the Liberty ships became the pulse of the modern industrial world. And yet, for all the machinery and progress that followed, nothing ever quite matched the spirit of those 5 days in Richmond. Because the true miracle hadn't been steel, it had been belief. Belief that skill could be taught, belief that tradition could bend, belief that ordinary people, given a chance and a purpose, could accomplish what the world called impossible. Years later, a historian asked one of Kaiser's old engineers, "What was it like?" The man smiled, eyes distant. "It was like standing in a thunderstorm made of light," he said. "Everywhere you looked, sparks were flying. You didn't think about sleep or fear or failure. You just worked, because you could feel something bigger than yourself moving through all of us." In the late 1950s, the Richmond yards were dismantled piece by piece. The cranes came down. The docks were cleared. Nature crept back in. The same gulls that had once fled the noise now circled quietly over calm water. But every so often, someone walking those empty piers could still find reminders: a rusted bolt, a faded sign, a piece of hull plate stamped with a serial number. Artifacts of an age when the impossible had been done not by heroes, but by neighbors. In 1981, long after Henry Kaiser's death, the old shipyard was declared a National Historic Site. On a clear morning, veterans and their families gathered along the same shoreline where sparks once filled the sky. Some brought photographs, others brought stories. A few carried pieces of metal salvaged from old ships. The mayor gave a speech, but it was the silence afterward that meant more. You could almost hear the echoes, the whistle, the welders, the distant splash of the Peary's hull as it hit the bay. When the ceremony ended, an old man in a wool cap lingered by the water. He had been a crane operator once, back in '42. He stared out at the calm surface, eyes wet, and whispered to no one in particular, "We built her fast so they could go fight. But I think we were fighting too, just in our own way." Then he nodded to himself, as if answering a question only time could ask. The SS Robert E. Peary herself was eventually scrapped. Her steel melted down, reborn into other machines, other bridges, other ships. But her story refused to die. Her photograph still hangs in museums, her name engraved on plaques, her legend retold in classrooms and documentaries. The Peary became less a vessel and more a symbol of faith under pressure, of hands united by purpose, of the day industry itself became human. And if you go to Richmond today, walk the shoreline where the shipyards once stood, you can still feel it. The air smells faintly of salt and history. The bay glints with the same light that reflected off those Liberty hulls. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in just right, it's easy to imagine the silhouettes of cranes rising from the mist again, the sound of sparks in the distance, and a voice calling through the wind. Time starts now. Because the legacy of Henry Kaiser and his army wasn't measured in tonnage or deadlines. It was measured in faith, in the idea that progress doesn't belong to experts alone. It belongs to anyone who dares to try, to learn, to build together. They said those Liberty ships were temporary, emergency vessels, disposable. But the truth is, nothing built on belief ever really sinks. Even today, somewhere across the quiet waters of San Francisco Bay, the tide carries whispers of that impossible week in 1942, when 1,000 ordinary Americans looked at an ocean and decided to fill it with proof. They didn't just build ships. They built faith. They built courage. They built proof.